Okay, so let's look at our bone cell types. Let's get that out of the way. And we're going to talk about 4 bone cell types. And these are going to be the cells that are essentially doing the work of bone, which is storing calcium and saving it for release for later if you need it. So releasing into the blood because we need calcium for all sorts of processes in our body, for contracting our muscles, for releasing neurotransmitter, all sorts of things we need calcium for. So we don't want to run low on calcium in the blood. So if we have excess calcium, we're storing it in the bone matrix. If we have not enough calcium in our blood, we're going to release it from the bone matrix. So we're putting calcium in and taking it out, and so on and so forth. And so that's really what these bone cells are doing, as well as giving your body structure by making this hard, dense matrix so that you can have an actual shape to yourself. You have leverage for your muscles, to something to pull on for your muscles, protection for your organs, things like that. So let's look at our bone cell types. Our first one that we're going to look at are stem cells, and those are the osteoprogenitors. And remember, we found those in the kind of along the edges of the compact bone. So in the periosteum, the endosteum, and then along the canals for blood vessels like the central canal or the perforating canals. Now, in the case of connective tissue, when you have a clump of stem cells, we would call that mesenchyme or mesenchymal cells, because they're the stem cells for connective tissue. So all of this can be used interchangeably. So osteoprogenitors, mesenchymal cells, mesenchyme, all of that meaning the same thing, these stem cells for bone. And what they're going to do is, when they are stimulated by various processes, which we don't need to get into at the moment, they're going to differentiate into osteoblasts. So they're going to turn into osteoblasts, produce osteoblasts. They'll divide and make osteoblasts. So what do osteoblasts do? They build bone. They do osteogenesis. So they're making bone matrix. And they do this by a couple of steps. They first secrete something called osteoid. That is the organic part of the matrix. So it contains carbohydrates, carbs, glycoproteins. Oops. So glycoprotein is a carbohydrate with a protein attached, but more carbohydrate than protein. Then we could have a proteoglycans, which would be, again, a protein and carbohydrate combination, but more protein because proteo comes first, less carb. And then also just proteins, water, things like that. So this is not dense. This is not bone how you think of bone. You need to calcify the bone in order to make it hard and strong. And we do that by attracting calcium into the bone and binding it there. So the osteoblast is going to secrete a couple of things that will attract the calcium into the bone and then bind it there. So at the same time that the osteoblast is making this osteoid, it's going to be releasing these strands of protein called bone sialoprotein. That's not really clear right there. Let me spell that back out again. Bone sialoprotein. This is a place that calcium can bind, but it's not just going to stick there, and it's not just going to wander in all by itself. It needs something to attract it, and it needs something to help it bind in a form that's going to stick to the bone sialoprotein. So the osteoblast is also secreting something called osteocalcin. The osteocalcin is going to attract the calcium, so the calcium comes into the matrix along with phosphate. So we bind the calcium together, so into calcium phosphate salts. And they're going to bind in a very specific kind of way, in a way that makes something called apatite crystals. You don't need to worry exactly about what that means. Just know the word apatite crystals. You'll see this if you ever take a geology class. You'll see that some minerals just kind of bind in this form. So this is the form that calcium and phosphate just bind in naturally. It's just a specific structure to the binding of these molecules. But this is the form that is able to stick to the sialoprotein. So here comes the calcium phosphate crystals binding to the sialoprotein. now we have calcified our osteoid and made it extremely dense and strong. So if you think about what this osteoblast has done, it's sitting there in its little place. It's secreting all this osteoid all around itself. It's just completely surrounding itself with osteoid, and then it makes it really dense. So it's just walled itself off. It still has, you know, the place where it's sitting there, where it's existing. But if you were to remove it, then it would be a space. So what does that remind you of? That's the lacuna that it just made for itself. It just blocked itself into a lacuna. And it will also leave space for canaliculi, which you can't see what I did there, so it's a different color, for canaliculi to attach to other bones or connect it to other bone cells, osteocytes, because that's what this osteoblast has now become. It has now become an osteocyte. Once it's walled itself off in its lacuna, it is now an osteocyte. So, what is that osteocyte going to do? It's essentially going to maintain the matrix around itself. It is responsible for keeping the matrix there, but it's not just responsible for building matrix. It's also responsible for kind of acting as negative feedback, because it doesn't want to have too much matrix around itself, and it doesn't want to overgrow bone, because you need to have the spaces, you need to have the canaliculi, you need to have the lacunae, you need to, you don't want to have too much bone mass. You want to have the right amount of bone mass. So the osteocyte is going to be kind of doing a give and take situation. It's mostly responsible for maintaining bone mass, but it can also kind of help to put the brakes on building bone mass, and you'll see in a second what I mean by that. So the osteocytes are the mature bone cells. They are completely encased in the lacunae, and they are connected with their canaliculi, so we know that already. And it's doing a bunch of things, or a bunch of things are being done to it also at the same time. So let's look at what it's doing, and then we'll look at what gets done to it, and we'll put it all together. So first, the osteocyte can secrete nitric oxide. And nitric oxide does a couple of things. First, it stimulates the osteoprogenitors into differentiating into osteoblasts, so causing those osteoprogenitors to start the process to build osteoblasts, which will then make matrix and then turn into more osteocytes. Now, another thing that nitric oxide can do is it will stop osteoclasts from forming. Osteoclasts are the cells that break down the bone, doing osteolysis, remember. So they're going to keep them from being made. They're saying, nope, we don't want you to break down the matrix right now, so we don't need any more osteoclasts. So everything nitric oxide is doing is aimed at increasing, I'll just put a little arrow here, increasing bone matrix by making osteoprogenitors, make osteoblasts, which make more osteocytes and more matrix, and keeping osteoclasts from breaking it down. Okay, now negative feedback for this, the osteocyte can also release enzymes that cause osteoblast apoptosis. Apoptosis is cell death, so these enzymes are killing osteoblasts. And when you kill osteoblasts, you're not making new bone matrix, you're not making new osteocytes, so you're decreasing how much bone matrix you would be having. So I'll just put a little downward arrow for increasing and for decreasing bone matrix. Okay, so things that are being done to the osteocyte. It has receptors for two hormones on the osteocyte. One is for estrogen, one is for parathyroid hormone. I'll spell that out. Parathyroid hormone, always abbreviated as PTH. Okay. So what do the estrogen receptors do? Well, estrogen comes along, binds to that estrogen receptor, and it stops the osteocyte from releasing these enzymes. So the osteocyte won't release the enzymes that kill the osteoblasts, so that is something that increases your bone mass. Okay. Before we get into the second part, which is inhibiting the parathyroid hormone receptors, let's look at what a parathyroid hormone receptor does. So here comes parathyroid hormone, binds to the parathyroid hormone receptor on the osteocyte, and this is going to cause the osteocyte to go through apoptosis, meaning it's going to kill the osteocyte. When you kill the osteocyte, it's not there to maintain its bone matrix anymore. That is decreasing your bone mass. It essentially allows osteoclasts to just have a field day with the matrix around that osteocyte. So we're decreasing bone matrix. So when the estrogen receptors inhibit that, they're essentially saying, no, parathyroid hormone, don't kill me now. So it's protecting the osteocyte from the parathyroid hormone. So that will keep your bone mass nice and steady. Okay, so we have things that increase the amount of bone mass, and we have a couple of things that also decrease the amount of bone mass for the osteocyte. Now, let's look at things that decrease the bone mass, which specifically are the osteoclasts. And what the osteoclasts do, we've mentioned this already, is osteolysis. They're breaking down the bone matrix. And they do that by acidifying it. And how they acidify it is that they release hydrogen ions. So we know that having a low pH or an acidic pH means a lot of hydrogen ions being free. So that's what they do. They release hydrogen ions. It essentially breaks up the calcium apatite crystals, releases them from the sialoprotein, and now we have this calcium unbound from the matrix. The osteoclast can take it into itself using endocytosis, and then once it has endocytosed that calcium, it will release it out the other side of itself into the blood. And now you have increased how much calcium you have in the blood, which is the whole point of osteolysis. You're trying to increase how much calcium you have in the blood. So normally what people think of when they think of breaking down bone is that that's bad, that you just want to build it. But it's not bad. You want to have a nice balance. You don't want to break down too much bone because then you'll get weak bones. That's not good. But you also don't want to build too much bone. So always think in terms of balance. So you always want to have kind of a, your osteoblasts are building at the same rate that your osteoclasts are taking away. And you want this to just be a constant in a nice equilibrium. You don't want your osteoblasts building more than your osteoclasts are taking away, generally, maybe a little bit, but not a whole lot, because then you're just going to get way too much bone. You don't want to have your osteoclasts taking away more than your osteoclasts are building, because then you're going to end up with weak bone. So you want to stay kind of nice and in the middle, which is just generally how everything works in the body anyway. So you find these osteoclasts on the outer edges of the compact bone, just like we mentioned before. You'll find them in the periosteum, the endosteum, and then those canals for the blood vessels. Now, everything else, all the other bone cell types, the osteoprogenitors, the osteoblasts, the osteocytes, they all came from the same lineage of cells. And the osteoclasts are going to come from a different lineage of cells. They come from specialized monocytes. And monocytes are a type of white blood cell that can move from the blood and into tissues and things like that. So that's where these osteoclasts are coming from. They're not coming from the osteoprogenitors, the osteoblasts, the osteocytes. They're not coming from the same sort of process at all. So the process of how you take the specialized monocyte and turn it into an osteoclast is called osteoclastogenesis. Genesis means the beginning of something. Osteoclast means osteoclast. So the beginning of the osteoclast, osteoclastogenesis. So how does this work? Here's our specialized monocyte. It's just moving along in the blood or through the tissue doing its thing, and if it bumps into a fibroblast or an osteoblast that is expressing a very particular membrane protein, it will be triggered to differentiate into the osteoclast. And this is the osteoclast. It looks very much different from just any kind of other cell. It's sort of like, almost looks like a fried egg almost, it's like all splatted out. It has something called the ruffled border here where it's sort of like floppy on its edges. And this is where it would be sitting right on top of the compact bone, secreting hydrogen onto there to acidify it to get the calcium out of there. Okay, so those are our bone cell types. So that is it.